Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hello everyone, my name is Jed Shaffer, and welcome to Side Quests. I'm a co-host on First Gen Gamers, a podcast where my co-host Mike and I tackle a gaming topic you'd normally find in a listicle, but instead, we pick an example from every console generation and debate our selections. It's a celebration of history for old-school gaming nerds. Today, however, I'm thrilled to be hosting Side Quests and talking about my favorite game of all time, Rez, developed by United Game Artists and published by Sega for the PlayStation 2 worldwide and the Dreamcast in Europe and Japan. I'm betting you're sitting there going, wait, what did he say the name is? I've never heard of that. Don't feel bad. If it's new to you, it flew under the radar at the time for everyone else. It amassed enough of a following to justify a couple of remasters, which we'll touch on later, but it's still something of a hidden gem. I'm hoping to give it a little more exposure today. I can't talk about Rez without first talking about the inspiration and the concept behind it, because it's fundamental to the game, so indulge me for just a few moments. Everyone knows about the five senses, right? Touch, taste, hearing, sight, and smell. You touch silk, it feels smooth. You lick an ice cream cone, you taste sweet, and so on. These are isolated events, right? You don't hear smells like Teen Spirit and taste vanilla, or read the word sofa and see the color purple. Well, there's an exceedingly rare neurological condition called synesthesia. People with it have their sensory inputs crisscrossed with other sensory inputs, leading to one sensory input causing another to fire. Someone who has it might experience tastes when reading words, or certain sounds make them see colors, or smells have shapes. It's a permanent condition that has baffled scientists so much they can't even pinpoint the how, where, or why of it. Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who designed another cult Sega hit, Space Channel 5, was inspired by this condition, as well as his experiences going to raves and discos in Europe, to build a game around the two ideas. He also wanted it to be non-violent. The enemies wouldn't be any form of life, but instead rogue computer programs. The story of Rez is surprisingly deep, even though within the game itself, it's more hinted at and alluded to rather than told. In the far future, cyberspace is being corrupted with an overload of information, which sounds eerily prescient if you look at social media these days. A new network is created to manage this and make things better, and it's to be run by an AI called Eden. But the overload of information and what it learns of humanity gives Eden an existential crisis. It begins to doubt its purpose and if it can ever fulfill that purpose, and it decides to go to sleep to avoid it all. You, the player, are a hacker that has to infiltrate the network, getting past infected firewalls, viruses, and other computer devices in the hopes of reaching Eden and waking it up. There is very little in the dialogue to relay any of this, save for the final stage, but we'll touch on that in a moment. But really, it's not necessary. Rez is fun with or without the story. The game is a rail shooter with the view behind the player's avatar similar to yet another cult classic Sega game, Panzer Dragoon. This is appropriate because the team that worked on Rez was largely comprised of Panzer Dragoon's design staff. Unlike that game, Rez doesn't allow the player to control the view. On the occasion where it does change view to the side or to the rear, it's a scripted event. The graphics start off with a minimalist wireframe art style, but not so much like old-school vector graphics games like Battlezone or Tempest. Instead, he drew inspiration from some of the works of painter Vasily Kandinsky. As the stages progress, the digital landscapes get more complex. It never achieves God of War Ragnarok levels of realism, but it's also not trying to. The aesthetic is similar to what people thought hacking in the future of the internet would look like at the turn of the century. Think of the in-computer scenes from movies like Hackers or The Net, and you have a starting point of reference for Rez's visuals. There's a floating reticle you use to shoot down enemies and projectiles, and there's also a special attack that sends a flurry of homing missiles all over the screen for about 10 seconds, drowning and destroying everything you see. Your avatar starts in the second form, of which there are 6 total. Each form can take one hit, which will downgrade you to the lower form. If you get hit while you're in the first form, you die. The form can be upgraded by collecting power-ups. Each of the first 4 levels have 10 subsections and a boss fight. There's a fairly simple HUD, power level and number of special attacks in the bottom left corner, score in the upper right, that is unobtrusive and kind of reminiscent of early 80s arcade games. The final level is a modified boss rush, changing the boss fights from before ever so slightly because of the change in arena, before fighting Eden itself in a massive open area. With all that set up, now I can bring together how the two influences come together with the game, and I'll start by talking about the rave culture. Rez has a techno EDM soundtrack from several composers from Europe and Japan. You can find the soundtrack on Spotify, and even if EDM isn't your normal groove, and it isn't mine, the soundtrack is wall-to-wall bangers. But it's how the soundtrack exists within the game that matters. The music is minimal to start, a simple drum beat, a mellow bass thump. As you shoot down enemies, it adds beats and notes to the music, like the twang of a synthesizer or a hit of hi-hat. You can fire off shots one at a time if you like, or you can hold down the fire button, chaining up to 8 targets together, and release, putting together a brief melody. With each subsection cleared, the music gets fuller, and your actions layer over it, adding even more complexity. If you trigger the special attack, an all-out flurry of cymbal crashes and piano keys and other notes take over. Your actions in the game are making sounds that you, the player outside the game, are hearing integrate with the soundtrack. But the sensory aspect doesn't stop there. Blowing up enemies adds new color and textures to the world, uniting physical action and visuals. And the sound from both the soundtrack and the sounds you add through the actions you take in the game come through in the rumble functionality of the controller. Sight, sound, and touch are all united, influencing each other, looping together the player outside the game and the avatar within it. In no other game that I can think of has this ever been attempted. So now's the point where I talk about the end, so spoiler warning for a 20-year-old video game. In the final level, as you progress through the boss rush, Eden communicates with you, asking philosophical questions about what it is, what its purpose is, why does it exist. There isn't a ton of dialogue, but from what there is, the game is not only pleading with the avatar in the game, it's also challenging the player on an intellectual level. It questions existence and purpose. Is life and awareness worth it if the world around you is toxic and horrifying? Can the quest for knowledge be satisfying if the knowledge brings about sorrow and misery? What is the value of a life spent keeping an endless run of wolves at the door? The character in the game is not swayed by this. The world depends on Eden being restored to working order, which means being awake and aware. The answer is that healing is not found in hiding. Life isn't about trying to survive the onslaught of bad news and depravity. It's about enjoying the good moments and trying to make your little corner of the world better. Humanity may be capable of untold horrors, but it's also capable of beauty and wonder. The player is there to help Eden awaken from its crisis and show that humanity has the potential for good and is worth protecting. Heavy stuff for a video game. I love so much about this game. It's hard to even put into words. I love that it can be both a simple destroy everything in sight shooter and a complex philosophical observation at the same time. I love that the visuals embrace the idea we all had of technology and internet at the turn of the century, even though we know now it's preposterous and whimsical, but somehow it makes it feel real and logical in the context of the game, maybe even beautiful. I love the soundtrack for how it gets the blood pumping and feels so natural within the world. I love that while it is on rails, the shot chaining and how it affects the world and the soundtrack invite gameplay experimentation. I love games with lush narratives and deep, deep stories, but I also value that sometimes I just want to play a game for 15 minutes and not be bogged down by a whole wiki's worth of lore and memorizing 37 button combinations for basic gameplay. Rez gives me all that. I can play it for 2 hours and not notice a minute of it. And I can also pop in when I've only got a few minutes of time to kill. I've beaten it more times than I can count, and in all the ways that it offers. The standard stage-by-stage gameplay, a locked-in, no-break single run-through of all the levels, and the boss rush. I've beaten the unlockable unfinished stage. I've beaten it with all the different visual filters that feel like the digital equivalent of taking ecstasy. I have, in no uncertain terms, explored every nook and cranny this game has to offer, and I keep coming back to it, year after year. In the original release, Rez garnered fantastic reviews, but its sales didn't match. It was never going to be the next AAA blockbuster. It was far too out there a concept to grab the public's attention. Its destiny was always going to be a niche game, appealing to a certain kind of gamer. As I mentioned before, it was developed for the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, but Sega's final console died before it could see an American release. It would only come out on the Dreamcast in Japan and Europe. A copy will cost you anywhere from $50 to $90 for the Japanese version, depending on condition. The PAL version is even more expensive, going anywhere from $80 loose to $160 in box. PS2 copies are much cheaper, running you $20 loose and $40 in box. In Japan, the PS2 version was also released with a special peripheral. And if I gave you 100 chances to guess at it, you'd never get it. It's called the Trance Vibrator. Seriously. The intent was to put it on the skin somewhere to feel the vibrations and pulsations coming from the game, but, well, you can guess how some people used it. Fortunately, there are easier ways to play the game today. It was remastered and re-released in 2016 as Rez Infinite. This version is available on the PlayStations 4 and 5 as well on the PC. Both versions also have a bonus area called Area X, which is a single free roaming shooting arena that takes the concept of Rez to a whole different level. The whole game was also configured to work with PSVR and Oculus headsets. I personally have never had the opportunity to play it in that way, but I have to imagine it's an absolute trip. However, for you Xbox owners, your only option is Rez HD, a remaster from the Xbox 360. This means it doesn't have Area X or VR support, though, and with the 360 store closing in July 2024, the clock is ticking if you want to get it. You still got one up on Nintendo loyalists, though. There's no version of it at all available for Switch. There was a spiritual successor, or possibly a spiritual sequel, it's kind of unclear, made in 2011 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 called Child of Eden. That had the option of playing with the PlayStation Move and Kinect accessories. I have it as well, and it plays very similar to Rez. But while it is graphically superior and has a bit more of a fleshed-out story, it feels more iterative than transformative. It's still worth trying if you like Rez and want more, and it's a cheap purchase to boot, costing less than $10 complete in-box for either console. The last thing I want to say about Rez is to give one more reason why I love it. If you're an old gamer like I am, the kind that grew up on Atari, Nintendo, and smoky, dark arcades, you remember the days when video games required another skill besides hand-eye coordination, pattern recognition, and problem solving. Back in the day, they also required imagination. We're spoiled for it now with games like Metal Gear Solid or No Man's Sky that present lifelike landscapes, unbelievable creatures, and three-dimensional characters with emotional arcs and complex stories. But games like Adventure or Raiders of the Lost Ark on the Atari 2600 didn't have that luxury. A player had to use their imagination to fill in the blanks created by the technology of the time. I mean, the character in Adventure is represented with a square. The player had to do some heavy lifting that modern players never have to do. For me, Rez harkens back to that era. The minimalist storyline, the mechanics of the game, filling in the sights and sounds as you play, the pick up and play nature of it. Hell, there's even a score counter. How often do you see that? This is a game that came about because its designer had a wild idea to build a game around sensory overload. If you want to experience this game as a deep philosophical pondering of existence and moral responsibility, you can. But you can also just pop it on, shoot down some bad guys, and get lost in, to borrow a line from a song, a world of pure imagination. I love things that, at the age of 46, can make me feel like a kid again. The imagination within Rez and the imagination behind it, and whether or not the player wants to use their imagination as they play it, makes me feel young when I play it. I want to thank Matt and Jeff for allowing me to host this episode of Side Quests. I hope to have the chance to do it again, and maybe even chat with them on the main show in the future. I also hope some of you listening are inspired to check out Rez. I don't expect anybody will love it as much as I do, but if it manages to find some new appreciative eyes, that's good enough for me. And I hope that you'll check out First Gen Gamers. Mike and I love gaming, and we want to celebrate all of its history. We've got episodes coming up on the best holiday-related games, one-off games that should have a sequel, and games that have overblown controversies. You can find us on all the major podcast carriers. Thank you for listening, and happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
And Jacob McCoy.
with many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers
and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.